Caroline Hale pressed both palms flat against the heavy oak door of Ashford Manor and closed her eyes. Her shoes were soaked through. Her dress was cold against her skin. She had walked 4 miles in the summer heat because she could not afford the coach fare, and she had told no one where she was going. Inside that door waited the man her father owed everything to. She had not come to beg. She had not come to cry. She had come to look Nathaniel Ashford in the eye and take whatever was coming for all of them. If this story moved you, subscribe to the channel so you never miss what happens next, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. The door opened before Caroline knocked. A woman in a starched white apron stood in the frame. Mid-50s square jaw, eyes that had spent decades deciding who was worth the trouble of a second look. She looked at Caroline once. Then she looked at the mud on Caroline's hem. Then she looked back at Caroline. "Deliveries go around back," the woman said. "I'm not making a delivery." Caroline lifted her chin. "I'm here to see Mr. Nathaniel Ashford. My name is Caroline Hale. My father is Samuel Hale. He has an account with Mr. Ashford, and I've come to discuss it." The woman Mrs. Pratt, as Caroline would later learn the housekeeper of Ashford Manor for 31 years, did not move from the doorway. "Mr. Ashford doesn't see visitors without appointment." "Then I'll wait." "You could be waiting all day, miss." "Then I'll wait all day." Mrs. Pratt looked at her again, longer this time. Caroline stood perfectly still in the morning heat, her back straight, both hands folded at her waist, her soaked shoes making no sound on the stone step. She didn't fidget. She didn't look away. Mrs. Pratt stepped back from the door. "The east parlor," she said flatly. "Don't touch anything." The east parlor smelled like beeswax and old leather, and the windows looked out over a stretch of land that went on so long, Caroline couldn't see where the fields ended. She didn't sit. She stood near the window with her hands still folded and watched a line of workers moving slowly across a distant field, bent at the waist, doing what men had done in Virginia summers for longer than anyone in this room had been alive. She counted them. 32. Maybe 35. Her father employed 4. Had employed 4. Past tense now. She heard boots on the floor behind her and turned. Nathaniel Ashford was not what she had imagined. She had imagined someone older, harder. A man who looked the way a debt felt cold and unmovable and slightly cruel around the eyes. What she saw instead was a man in his early 30s, tall and unhurried with dark brown hair that needed cutting and a jaw that hadn't been shaved this morning. He wore no coat. Just a plain linen shirt rolled to the elbows and dark trousers, and he carried a leather ledger under one arm, the way other men carried a walking stick, like he didn't need it to feel important, but kept it close anyway. He stopped just inside the doorway. He looked at her the way she had looked at his workers, quietly, counting. "Miss Hale," he said, not a question. "Mr. Ashford." She met his eyes. "Thank you for seeing me." "Mrs. Pratt said you'd wait all day." "I would have." He walked to the chair behind the writing desk, but didn't sit in it. He set the ledger down on the surface, opened it to a page near the back, and read something without looking up. "Samuel Hale," he said. "Merchant. Commission trade dry goods, some livestock speculation." He turned a page. 3 loans. The first taken out in the spring of 1815, the second in the fall of that year, the third in January of 1817. He closed the ledger. "None repaid." "No," Caroline said. "None repaid. The total outstanding with interest is $4,216. She had known the number. She had written it at the top of a piece of paper that morning before she left the house, so she wouldn't flinch when she heard it. She didn't flinch. "Yes," she said. "I know." He looked at her for a long moment. "You're not his attorney," he said. "No." "You're not a business partner." "No." "Then why are you here, Miss Hale, and not your father?" She held his gaze and answered the way she had practiced answering, plain and without ornamentation. "Because my father is not well enough to make this journey, and because even if he were, he wouldn't come. He is ashamed. He has been ashamed for 3 years, and it has made him smaller every month. And I believe that a man who is too ashamed to face what he owes becomes a man who will never recover from it. So I came instead." Silence. Nathaniel Ashford looked at her with an expression she couldn't read. It wasn't unkind. It wasn't warm. It was simply careful, the way a man looks at something he didn't expect to find and hasn't yet decided what to make of. "And what?" he said slowly. "Do you intend to say to me that your father cannot?" "I intend to say that the debt is real and we don't dispute it. I intend to say that my father made poor decisions, and I'm not here to defend them. I'm not here to ask you to forgive the debt or reduce it or delay it further." She paused. "I'm here to ask you for time, not mercy. Time. 3 years. If you give us 3 years and reasonable terms, I believe we can repay what is owed. I have a plan, and I will show it to you if you'll let me." He was quiet again. "You have a plan," he repeated. "Yes, sir." "You're 24 years old." "I am." "And you've come to the house of the man your father owes $4,000 to uninvited, after walking, what, 4 miles, based on the state of your shoes?" 4.5. Something moved across his face. Not quite a smile. Not quite surprise. Something in between. "Sit down, Miss Hale," he said. She sat. She pulled a folded paper from the small bag she carried, 2 pages covered front and back in her own handwriting, and she spread them on the edge of the desk between them. He leaned forward. He didn't touch the papers, but he read them. She watched his eyes move line by line. Her plan was not elegant. It was not the kind of document a lawyer would be proud to put his name on. But it was real. She had written down every asset the Hale family still owned: the house, the remaining furniture, her mother's silver 2 mares, a 1/4-acre kitchen garden. She had written down what she could raise in 1 year from selling dried herbs and preserves from the garden, what she could earn taking in mending work through the winter, what her father could bring in consulting for other merchants on trade routes he knew from 30 years in the business. She had added it up, column by careful column. Year 1, $620, if nothing went wrong. Year 2, $800, if the garden expanded as she intended. Year 3, the rest if her father regained enough strength and standing to conduct business again. Nathaniel Ashford read it twice. Then he sat back. "This garden," he said. 1/4 acre. What do you grow?" She blinked. She had not expected that question. "Currently, tomatoes, beans, summer squash. Some herbs, rosemary, thyme, sage. I have lavender along the south fence. I started apple seedlings in March, but they won't bear for years yet." "Apple seedlings," he said. "Yes, sir." He looked at her for a moment that stretched long enough that she had to work not to fill it with words. "Come back in 3 days," he said at last. I beg your pardon. 3 days. Come back Thursday morning, and I'll have an answer for you." She hadn't expected that either. She had expected a refusal. She had steeled herself for a refusal. She had 3 responses prepared for a refusal, ranging from gracious acceptance to a firm but polite argument. She had nothing prepared for this. "All right," she said. She folded her papers carefully and put them back in her bag. She smoothed her skirt and looked at him. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Ashford. Miss Hale." He said her name the way he said everything, without hurry. "The apple seedlings. How many?" 6, she said. "Why?" He didn't answer. He picked up his ledger and opened it again. She let herself out. Mrs. Pratt was waiting in the hallway. Caroline suspected she had been standing there the entire time, near enough to the parlor door to hear what passed between them. "I'll show you out," Mrs. Pratt said. "I remember the way, thank you." The housekeeper walked beside her anyway down the long hall toward the front door, past 2 oil portraits of men with Nathaniel Ashford's jawline, and a side table with a vase of white roses beginning to brown at the edges. At the door, Mrs. Pratt paused. "How is your mother?" she said. Caroline stopped. "You knew my mother. Margaret Walsh, before she married your father. She and I went to the same church until she was 17, and your grandfather moved the family to Richmond." The housekeeper's voice was as flat as it had been all morning. "I heard she passed 2 winters ago." She did. Fever. Mrs. Pratt nodded once the way old women nod when they've outlived enough people that grief has become a private language they no longer bother translating. She was a good woman, she said. Raised a girl with a straight spine by the look of it. Caroline didn't know what to say to that, so she said, "Thank you, Mrs. Pratt," and walked out into the summer morning. The 4.5-mile walk home gave her a great deal of time to think, and very little of it was comfortable. She had not told her father she was coming here. He would have stopped her. He would have called it foolishness and pride and something worse, and he would have been wrong about all of it. But he was her father, and he would have said it anyway, and she would not have been able to leave the house with his voice following her down the road. So she had said nothing. She had risen before him, dressed quietly, eaten half a piece of bread, standing over the kitchen counter, and walked out while the dew was still on the grass. She would have to tell him now. He would know she'd been somewhere. The mud on her dress would tell him that much, and her father, for all his failures, had never been a stupid man. She thought about Nathaniel Ashford. She had expected a monster or something close enough to one to make what she had to do feel like facing a monster. Instead, she had found a man who read ledgers the way scholars read books and asked about apple seedlings without explaining why. She had found a man who listened. Not patiently. Patience implied tolerance. He had listened with attention the way you listen to something that might turn out to matter. She didn't know what to make of that. She didn't know what to make of him saying come back in 3 days rather than yes or no. 3 days meant he was thinking about it. 3 days meant the answer wasn't obvious to him, and if the answer wasn't obvious to a man who owned more of this county than anyone she'd ever met, then she had said something he wasn't expecting. She held on to that thought the whole 4.5 miles home. Her father was in this kitchen when she arrived. He was sitting at the table with a cold cup of coffee and the newspaper. Except he wasn't reading the newspaper. He was staring at the far wall with the paper open in his hands as though he'd forgotten it was there. He was 58 years old, and he looked 70. The last 3 years had done that to him. Not quickly. Slowly, the way a fence post rots, you don't see it happening until one morning you lean on it and it gives. He looked up when she came in. He saw the mud on her dress. He saw the way she was holding herself straight and careful the way she held herself when she'd done something she was ready to account for. "Where did you go?" he said quietly. "I went to see Nathaniel Ashford," she said. She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. "I asked him for 3 years to repay what we owe. I showed him a plan. He said he'd give us an answer Thursday." Her father set the newspaper down. For a moment, he said nothing at all. His face was very still, and she couldn't tell if what moved behind his eyes was anger or grief or something that had no name, because no one had felt exactly this version of it before. "Caroline," he said. His voice came out strange, scraped thin. "It's done, Papa. I went and I came back and now we wait. You should not have—" He stopped, pressed one hand flat on the table. "You should not have gone there alone. Someone had to go. Not you, not alone, not without telling me." "If I'd told you," she said gently, "you would have stopped me." He didn't argue that. He couldn't. "He's not a man to be trifled with," Samuel Hale said. "You don't know him, Caroline. You don't know what he's capable of." "He listened to me. He read the plan I wrote. He asked about the garden." Her father stared at her. "He asked about the garden." "About the apple seedlings. I didn't understand why." Samuel Hale was quiet for a long time. Then he said very quietly, "His mother grew apples, Eleanor Ashford. She had an orchard on the south side of the property. Magnificent thing, everyone in the county knew it. She died 8 years ago. The orchard's been abandoned since." Caroline sat with that. "He didn't say why he asked," she said. "No," her father said. "I don't suppose he would." Thursday came the way. Thursdays come, in Virginia in the summer. Hot from the moment the sun cleared the tree line, the air already thick with the smell of dry earth and cut hay. Caroline rose early again, but this time she told her father where she was going. He didn't try to stop her. He watched her from the doorway with his coffee cup in both hands and said, "Be careful." And she said, "I will be." And she walked out. She had not slept well. 2 nights of half sleep and bad dreams. Not frightening dreams, just anxious ones. The kind where you can't find the thing you're looking for, even though you know it should be right there. She was tired in the way that doesn't show unless someone looks at your eyes. She knocked this time, rather than pressing her palms to the door. Mrs. Pratt answered. Less surprise on her face than Monday. Almost something like expectation. He's in the orchard, Mrs. Pratt said. South side of the property. Follow the fence line. Caroline followed the fence line. She smelled it before she saw it. Or rather, she smelled the absence of what should have been there, the sweet green smell of healthy fruit trees. What she found instead was a quarter-mile of trees that had not been properly tended in years. Crowded branches. Unpruned suckers. A few trees leaning at angles that would eventually kill them. The grass beneath was long and going to seed. And standing in the middle of all of it, with his coat off and his sleeves rolled up and a look on his face that she had no category for, was Nathaniel Ashford. He heard her footsteps in the grass and turned. "Miss Hale," he said. "Mr. Ashford." He looked at the trees. She looked at the trees. For a moment, neither of them said anything. "You know what's wrong with them," he said. It wasn't quite a question. She walked closer to the nearest tree and looked at it carefully. She reached up and broke a small dead branch between her fingers, looked at the interior dry, no moisture dead for at least 2 seasons. She looked at the crown of the tree, at the way the branches crossed each other and fought for light. "They need a hard pruning," she said. "Cut back maybe a third of the old wood. Clear the suckers from the base. They need air and light or they'll strangle each other." She walked to the next tree. "This one has borer damage on the trunk. You see these holes here? You'd need to remove the infected sections before it spreads to the others. The ground is too compacted." She crouched and pressed 2 fingers into the soil. "When did anyone last turn this earth?" 7 years, he said. "Maybe 8. She stood. "The trees are older stock, they're not dead. You'd lose 2 or 3 probably. But the rest can come back. It would take 2 seasons of real work, maybe 3. But they'd bear again." He was watching her with that same unreadable attention he'd had in the parlor Monday. "You're certain," he said. "No. You can never be entirely certain with trees. But I've never lost an orchard I decided to save." She looked at him directly. "Why did you bring me out here?" He was quiet for a moment. "I want to know if you believe what you put on that paper," he said. "Or if you wrote things down because they sounded reasonable, and you hoped I wouldn't look too closely." "Everything on that paper is true. The numbers are optimistic. They're achievable. There's a difference. Some would say it's a fine distinction. Then some would be wrong." She met his eyes without looking away. "Mr. Ashford, I did not walk 9 miles in 2 days to show you a document I didn't believe in. Everything I wrote was real. Every number was conservative by my own estimate. If I put a higher number down and missed it, we'd be worse off than we are. I'd rather promise less and deliver it than promise more and fail again." He looked at her for a long moment. "Your father," he said. "Would he agree with you about his own recovery?" The question landed in an undefended place. She felt it. She kept her face even. "My father," she said carefully, "is a good man who made terrible decisions and has not yet forgiven himself for them. Whether he can come back from that is not something I can promise you. The only thing I can promise is that I will not let his shame become the thing that ruins what's left." Nathaniel Ashford looked at the trees, then at her. "I'm not going to give you 3 years," he said. Her stomach dropped. She had been so careful not to expect anything. "I'm going to give you one condition," he said. "And if you accept it, the debt will be resolved. Entirely. Not restructured. Resolved." She stared at him. "What condition?" He looked at her straight, the way he'd looked at her since the moment she walked through his door, without apology, without deflection, as if he'd decided to simply say the true thing and let it land where it landed. "I need to be married before my 34th birthday," he said. "That's November. My grandfather's will is very clear on the point. If I'm unmarried when I turn 34, the Ashford estate passes to a cousin I've met twice and have no respect for. I've been approached by every family with an unmarried daughter in 3 counties. Every one of them wants something I can't afford to give." "And what is that?" she said, though she thought she already knew. A wife who wants this estate more than she wants a husband. He said it simply without bitterness. I don't need someone who wants my land or my name or my money. I need someone who will run this house and this property with some competence and some honesty, and not spend every waking hour trying to extract things from me. He paused. On Monday you walked in here and told me your father's debt was real, you weren't disputing it, and you weren't asking for mercy. Then you put a plan in front of me that showed 2 pages of honest arithmetic. She was very still. You're asking me to marry you, she said. I'm presenting you with a condition, he said. You can accept it or refuse it. Either way, I'll give you my answer before you leave today. Caroline Hale stood in the ruined orchard of Ashford Manor on a Thursday morning in June 1818 with the heat pressing down through the dead and living branches of apple trees that had been waiting 8 years for someone to decide they were worth saving. And she thought about every single thing she had told herself this morning on the walk here. That she was coming for her family. That she would be calm and honest and not ask for more than they were owed. That she would accept whatever answer he gave her. She had not planned for this answer. I need to think, she said. Of course. He picked up his coat from where it lay over a low branch. Mrs. Pratt will give you tea. Take all the time you need. He walked back toward the house. She stood alone in the abandoned orchard. She looked at the trees. All of them. The ones that could be saved, and the ones that couldn't, and the ones she wasn't sure about yet, the ones that needed someone to make a decision about them before it was too late. She looked at them for a long time. Mrs. Pratt gave her tea in the kitchen rather than the east parlor. Caroline suspected this was intentional a kindness, even if it didn't look like one. The kitchen was warm and smelled like bread, and no one expected you to sit straight in the kitchen. She sat at the long table with her hands wrapped around a cup, and she thought. She thought about her father at the kitchen table with his cold coffee and his unread newspaper staring at the wall. She thought about what he'd looked like 3 years ago before the first loan, before the failed investments, before the shame had gotten into him. The way cold gets into an old house through every gap, every crack you never thought to seal. She thought about the house they lived in now, smaller than where she'd grown up, with a ceiling that leaked in the northeast bedroom, and a porch step that had been soft for 6 months and no one had fixed it. She thought about her mother, who had been dead for 2 winters, and whose absence was a shape in every room. She thought about a man who asked about apple seedlings. She thought about an orchard that wasn't dead. She set down her cup. She found Nathaniel Ashford in his study. He was at his desk with the ledger again, not reading it. His pen was in his hand, but he wasn't writing. He looked up when she appeared in the doorway. I'll accept, she said, but I have conditions of my own. He put the pen down. He was very still. Say them, he said. My father keeps the house until he dies. Whatever happens between us, that house is not collateral for anything, and it's not part of any negotiation after today. Agreed. I will run this household as I see fit. I won't be managed by staff who were here before me, and I won't be told how to do things I already know how to do. Agreed. The orchard, she said. I want to restore it. That's not a request. That's a condition. Something changed in his face. Not much. Enough. Agreed, he said. And I won't be a business arrangement that you put in a room and forget about. She said it quietly but without flinching. I understand that this marriage will begin as a practical matter. I'm not asking you to pretend otherwise. But I won't be invisible in my own home, and I won't smile and nod while decisions are made around me. If you want someone to do that, I'm not the right choice. He stood up from his desk. He was taller than she'd registered in the orchard, or maybe it was just that the room was smaller. Miss Hale, he said, I did not ask you specifically because I wanted someone who would smile and nod. She looked at him for a moment. Then we have an agreement, she said. He extended his hand. Not the way men extended their hand to women in parlors, not decorative, not a bow folded into a gesture. Like he was closing a contract with someone whose word he intended to hold. She shook it. His hand was warm, and his grip was firm, and he let go the exact moment that was right. I'll have the paperwork drawn up, he said. and I'll send word to the county clerk." 3 weeks is enough time, she said, for the arrangements. 3 weeks, he agreed. She turned to go. "Miss Hale." She stopped. "The condition about the orchard." He paused. "You included it because you want to restore it, or because you thought it would matter to me?" She thought about lying, about saying something gracious and indirect that would let him believe whatever served him best. She was capable of that. She'd been raised capable of it. "Both," she said honestly. "I want to restore it, and I believed it would matter to you." He nodded once, like she'd said the true thing, and he'd known she would. She walked down the long hallway of Ashford Manor, past the browning white roses and the oil portraits with their familiar jawlines, out through the heavy oak door and down the wide stone steps and into the Virginia summer. The walk home was 4.5 miles. It felt shorter than it had on Monday. She didn't know what was waiting for her. Not in 3 weeks, not in 3 months, not in 3 years. She didn't know Nathaniel Ashford, not really, not yet. She knew he read ledgers carefully and listened without interrupting, and had let his mother's orchard go to ruin, because there are things so tied to grief that you can't touch them until someone else offers to touch them first. She knew she had not said yes for money. She had said yes because she could save those trees. And because something in her, some stubborn, unreasonable, wide-open part of her, believed that a man who had kept a dead orchard rather than cut it down was a man who had not given up on something, even though he'd stopped looking at it. That was not nothing. She walked home through the summer heat and started making a list in her head. Tools she'd need, which trees to start with, how to approach the borer damage before it spread. When she got home, her father was still at the kitchen table. He looked up at her face. "Caroline," he said slowly. "What happened?" She sat down. She folded her hands on the table the way she'd folded them on the stone step of Ashford Manor 4 days ago, when she hadn't known what was inside. "I'm going to be married in 3 weeks, Papa," she said. "And our debt is going to be paid. And you're going to keep the house." Samuel Hale looked at his daughter for a long moment. His eyes were full of something she hadn't seen there in years. "To whom?" he said very quietly. "To Nathaniel Ashford," she said. Her father closed his eyes. She reached across the table and covered his hands with hers. "It's going to be all right," she said. She didn't know if that was true, but she said it like she meant it, because sometimes that's the most important thing a person can do. Outside the window. The summer afternoon was long and golden and very still. 3 weeks. She had work to do. The wedding was set for the second Saturday of July. Caroline told no one outside the family for the first 3 days. Not because she was ashamed of it, she had made her decision with clear eyes, and she stood by it, but because she understood that the moment it became public, the story would stop being hers. It would belong to everyone else, and everyone else would get it wrong in the particular way that towns always get things wrong, with great confidence and very little accuracy. She was right about that. By the 5th day, the whole county knew. She first heard it from Martha Pruitt at the dry goods store on Wednesday morning, 3 days after her second visit to Ashford Manor. She had gone in for salt and a spool of thread. Nothing else, and Martha Pruitt was a woman who could make the sale of salt and thread last 45 minutes if she had something worth saying. "I heard the most extraordinary thing this morning," Martha said, folding her hands on the counter with the satisfaction of someone who has been waiting all day for a worthy audience. "I heard that Nathaniel Ashford is getting married, to the Hale girl." Caroline set her coins on the counter. "The salt, please, Mrs. Pruitt." Martha Pruitt blinked at her, then looked at her more carefully. Then her mouth opened. "Caroline Hale," she said. "You're the Hale girl." "I am." Caroline picked up her salt. "The thread too, if you don't mind." "But when did this your father's debts?" "The thread, Mrs. Pruitt." She got the thread. She walked out. Behind her she heard Martha Pruitt make a sound that was somewhere between a gasp and a word, and then the door closed between them, and Caroline walked down the main street of Harrowfield, Virginia, with her salt and her thread, and the absolute certainty that by supper time there would be a version of this story circulating that bore almost no resemblance to what had actually happened. She was correct. By Thursday 3, Separate people had told her father in what they apparently believed were sympathetic tones that they'd heard his daughter had thrown herself at Nathaniel Ashford's feet and begged him to take her in exchange for the debt. One of them patted Samuel Hale's hand while saying it. Her father, who had spent 3 years shrinking under the weight of his own shame, raised himself to his full height in the doorway of his house and said with a steadiness that surprised even Caroline when he recounted it to her that evening, "My daughter has never begged for anything in her life, and I'll thank you to say nothing further on the subject." He closed the door on the man's face. Caroline heard that and felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight for longer than she could name. She looked at her father across the supper table at the small, stubborn remnant of the man he'd been before the debts, and she thought, there he is. He's still in there. She reached over and put more bread on his plate. He didn't say anything. Neither did she. The person who complicated everything arrived on Friday. Caroline was in the back garden pulling early weeds from between the bean rows when she heard the carriage. A good carriage, she could tell by the sound of the wheels on dry road evenly weighted, well-maintained stop in front of the house. She stood up and brushed her hands on her apron and walked around the side of the house in time to see a young woman step down from the carriage with the kind of effortless grace that is either entirely natural or the result of being told since infancy that everyone is watching. She was perhaps 22. Dark-haired, pale-skinned, dressed in the kind of blue traveling gown that announced serious money without stating it directly. She was beautiful in the way that certain paintings are beautiful, so finished and exact that you look at them with admiration rather than feeling. She looked at Caroline and said, "You must be the girl from the debt." Caroline held her garden hat in both hands. "My name is Caroline Hale, and you are Victoria Langston." She said the name the way people say names they believe should require no further explanation. When Caroline's expression didn't change, something sharpened slightly in Victoria Langston's eyes. "My father is Aldous Langston of Charleston. He and Nathaniel's father were in business together for 30 years. Nathaniel and I have known each other since we were children." "Miss Langston," Caroline said, "what can I do for you?" Victoria Langston looked at her for a moment, a long, measuring, unhurried look, and then she smiled. It was a lovely smile. It didn't reach her eyes. "I thought," she said, "that we should talk." They sat in the front parlor, which was the only room in the Hale house that could still be called presentable. Caroline did not offer tea. She sat in the chair across from Victoria Langston and folded her hands and waited. "I'm going to speak plainly," Victoria said, "because I think you're the kind of woman who prefers that." "I am. You're making a mistake." She said it without cruelty, conversationally, like she was commenting on the weather. "Not a moral mistake. I'm not here to lecture you. A practical one. You don't know Nathaniel Ashford. You've met him twice. You know his ledger and his orchard, and that he listened to your plan without throwing you out, which is not nothing, but it is also not a marriage." "I'm aware of that," Caroline said. "He's not an easy man." Victoria smoothed the fabric of her skirt across her knee. "He doesn't explain himself. He doesn't offer comfort. He doesn't apologize. He has expectations that he considers self-evident, and he will never understand why you can't simply see them too. He is brilliant, and he is cold, and he is capable of sitting across from a person he respects and making them feel entirely invisible, not from cruelty, but from pure, absolute, unself-conscious self-containment." She paused. "I have known him for 20 years. I am telling you what I know." Caroline was quiet for a moment. "You know him very well," she said. "Yes." "Then why isn't he marrying you?" The question landed exactly where she aimed it. Victoria Langston's smile went very still. "There have been conversations," Victoria said carefully. "Have there been a proposal? A beat? Not formally." "Not formally," Caroline repeated. "Miss Langston, you've come to my house and told me I'm making a mistake, and you've done it with such obvious personal investment that I can't pretend I don't know what this is." She kept her voice even. "If Nathaniel Ashford had wanted to marry you, he would have asked you before his grandfather's will became a problem. He didn't. That is not my fault, and it is not yours, but it is the truth." Victoria Langston looked at her for a long moment. "You're going to get hurt," she said. "Perhaps," Caroline said. "But that's my concern, not yours." She stood, which ended the conversation, whether Victoria was ready for it to end or not. "I'll walk you back to your carriage." Victoria rose. She was slightly taller than Caroline, and she moved with the unhurried confidence of someone who has never had to rush anywhere in her life. At the door she stopped. "The whole county will say you trapped him," she said quietly. "That you used the debt. That you took advantage of a man under pressure." "The whole county," Caroline said, "can think what it likes. I'll know what I did." Something moved across Victoria Langston's face. Something more complicated than the composed surface she'd been presenting. Something that might in different circumstances have been respect. "Good morning, Miss Hale," she said. "Good morning, Miss Langston." The carriage drove away. Caroline went back to her beans. She didn't tell Nathaniel about the visit. Not immediately. She turned it over in her mind for a day and a half, looking at it from different angles, asking herself whether he needed to know and whether not telling him was a small dishonesty she was already building into the foundation of something that had not yet begun. She decided he should know. Not because it was dramatic, but because she had told him she would not be invisible in her own life, and that meant she couldn't start by editing the parts that were inconvenient. She sent him a note. He appeared at the Hale house the following morning. He did not ride, or if he had ridden, he'd left the horse at the road. He appeared on foot at the front door in his plain linen and his uncut hair and his ledger under his arm, which Caroline was beginning to suspect was less a working document and more the closest thing he had to a security blanket. And he looked at her when she opened the door and said, "Victoria." "Yes," she said. "Come in." They sat at the kitchen table. Her father had taken himself tactfully to the back of the property. She'd seen him heading toward the old smokehouse with his toolbox, which was a thing he hadn't done in 3 years. She appreciated the gesture. "What did she say?" Nathaniel asked. Caroline told him. All of it without softening the parts that reflected on him. When she described Victoria's portrait of his character, cold, self-contained, incapable of making someone feel seen, she watched his face. He didn't argue. He didn't flinch. He listened with that level, careful attention he seemed to bring to everything. "She's not wrong," he said when she finished. Caroline looked at him. "She's not entirely wrong," he amended. I don't do things by halves. That includes silence. I've been told it's difficult to be around." She said you'd never understand why someone couldn't simply read your mind. That's a fair criticism. He set the ledger on the table the first time she'd ever seen him put it down without holding it. "She's been my friend for a long time. Whatever else she is or wants, she's known me longer than almost anyone. What she told you about my character was not strategy, it was genuine." "I know," Caroline said. "That's why I wanted you to know about the visit. Because she wasn't lying. And I think you should know that I heard her, and I made my own assessment, and I'm still here." He looked at her across the table. "That must have been an interesting conversation," he said. "It was educational," Caroline said. "She's formidable. She came to my house and dismantled your character in front of me without once raising her voice." "That sounds like Victoria." "She also told me the whole county is going to say I trapped you." "The whole county," he said, "can go to the devil." She hadn't expected that. A startled, genuine laugh broke out of her before she could stop it, and she pressed her hand over her mouth, and when she looked up at him, his face had changed. Not a lot, not in any theatrical way, but enough. Something had shifted around his eyes. Something that looked like surprise, and underneath the surprise, something softer that he didn't seem entirely comfortable with. "I have to tell you something," he said. His voice had changed, slightly lower. She sat up a little straighter. "What is it?" "The condition I set." He looked at the table for a moment. "The marriage before November. I want you to understand, it's real. The will is real. But I didn't ask you because you were the only option. There were options. There are 3 families in this county alone who have been after me to consider their daughters. I chose not to." She was very still. Why? I was quiet for a moment that stretched long enough for her to hear her own heartbeat. "Because on Monday morning, a girl with mud on her shoes walked into my parlor and told me she hadn't come to ask for mercy, he said. She told me the debt was real, and she wasn't disputing it. She told me she had a plan, and then she put a plan in front of me that was honest enough to be imperfect. He met her eyes. I've been offered a great many things in my life, Miss Hale. No one has ever offered me honesty before they offered me anything else. Caroline Hale sat very still at the kitchen table of her father's house and felt something she didn't have a word for move through her like warm water. She held it at a careful distance. "That's a significant thing to tell someone," she said. "I'm aware," he said. "I told you I don't do things by halves." "No," she said. "I'm beginning to understand that." He picked up the ledger, stood. She stood too. 3 weeks, he said. 3 weeks, she agreed. He picked up his hat from where he'd set it on the empty chair and turned it in his hands for a moment, a habit she noticed now for the first time, this thing he did when he was thinking. Then he put it on. "Miss Hale," he said at the door. "For what it's worth, the county will say what it says for about 6 months, and then it will find something else to talk about. They always do." "I know," she said. "I'm not afraid of the county." "No," he said. "I didn't think you were." He walked out into the summer morning, and she watched him go, and she thought about what it meant that a man could say you were the only person who offered me honesty before anything else, and say it in that level, unhurried voice, like it was the most natural thing in the world to confess, like he'd thought about saying it for a week, and decided it was simply true, and so it should be said. She thought about that for a long time. 3 weeks passed. The way. 3 weeks always pass when you're waiting for your life to change, simultaneously, very fast and very slow. The days ordinary and the hours strange. She spent most of it working. There was the garden to manage the daily rhythm of the kitchen. Her father's gradual, tentative return to something resembling himself. He had fixed the porch step on Saturday, which was the first household repair he'd made in 2 years, and she had not made a fuss about it because she understood instinctively that making a fuss would make him feel observed in his own recovery, which was the one thing that would stop it. She just said, "Thank you, Papa," when she walked over it that evening matter-of-factly, and he nodded and went back inside, and that was enough. She made 2 more trips to Ashford Manor, not to see Nathaniel, to walk the orchard. Mrs. Pratt let her in both times without comment and pointed her toward the south fence without being asked, and Caroline walked the rows of neglected trees with a notebook and made careful, precise notes about which trees could be saved and in what order and with what method. And she drew a rough map of the property that she folded into the back of the notebook. On the second visit, she stayed long enough that Mrs. Pratt brought her lunch in the orchard without being asked. Cold chicken and good bread and a jar of sweet tea left on the old stone wall without ceremony. Caroline said, "Thank you, Mrs. Pratt." Mrs. Pratt said, "You're going to need sturdier boots than those." "I know, I ordered them last week." Mrs. Pratt looked at the trees, then at Caroline. Then she said, with the careful economy of a woman who doesn't waste words, "She would have liked you, Mrs. Eleanor." The orchard was hers. Everything worth keeping around here was hers. She paused. "He knows that. It's why he left it. He couldn't tend it, and he couldn't bear to cut it down." Caroline looked at the trees, the ones that could be saved, and the ones that were too far gone, and the ones she wasn't sure about yet. "I'll bring it back," she said. Mrs. Pratt picked up the empty tray. "I know you will," she said. "That's why I'm telling you." The wedding was small. There was no other word for it. The church held maybe 40 people, and most of those 40 were there out of curiosity rather than celebration, which Caroline understood and chose not to spend any energy on. She wore her mother's dress, which she'd taken in at the waist and let out slightly at the shoulders, and she carried a small bunch of lavender from the south fence of her father's garden, because she hadn't wanted flowers that came from someone else's arrangement. She walked herself down the aisle. Her father had offered. She had looked at him and said, "Walk beside me." And he had right up until the front pew, where he took her hand and squeezed it once, and then let her go. Nathaniel Ashford stood at the front of the church in a dark coat that had been pressed carefully, and a cravat that had not. And he watched her walk toward him with the same attention he'd given every single thing she'd done in front of him. The complete, careful, unperformative attention of a man who is genuinely interested in what he's looking at. When she reached him, she said quietly for only the two of them, "You might have combed your hair." Something moved across his face that not quite smiled the thing he did instead of smiling. "You might have worn different shoes," he said just as quietly, looking at her boots. The new ones, sturdier as Mrs. Pratt had prescribed. She almost laughed. She held it in by the thinnest margin. The Reverend began. She said the words. He said the words. They were old words used by so many people in so many different circumstances that they'd been worn smooth, like river stones, but she meant them. Not all of them fully yet, because you can't mean all of a promise before you understand what keeping it will require. But she meant the intention behind them. She meant, "I will try." She meant, "I will not run." She meant, "I will look at this honestly and not look away." He placed a plain gold band on her finger. His hand was warm and steady. Outside the church in the bright July heat, while Harrowfield, Virginia murmured around them. Victoria Langston was standing at the edge of the churchyard. Caroline saw her when they came through the door. She was standing very straight in gray, not morning gray, just gray, like she'd dressed to be somewhere that wasn't here and ended up here anyway. She met Caroline's eyes for exactly 1 second. Then she turned and walked away. Caroline held her lavender in both hands and watched her go. Nathaniel's hand was at the small of her back, not possessive, not demonstrative, just present a warmth through her dress that was steadying rather than clinging. "She came," he said quietly. "She did," Caroline said. "That took some courage," he said. "To watch." "Yes," Caroline said. "It did." She felt his hand move, not removing itself, just shifting slightly, settling, like something that had been held tentatively being set down properly. "Ready," he said. She took a breath of July air heat and hay, and the lavender crushed slightly in her hands from holding it too tight. "Ready," she said. They walked out of the churchyard together. Behind them, Martha Pruitt turned to the woman beside her and said something that Caroline didn't hear and didn't need to hear. And all around them, the small, confident, endlessly self-assured machinery of a small town in motion did what it always did. It watched, it talked. It drew conclusions from the outside of things. Let it, Caroline thought. She was going home. Not the home she'd grown up in. Not the home she'd managed for 3 years with inventories and careful budgets and pride held straight against the wind. A new one. An empty one. An orchard that was barely alive in a house full of rooms she didn't know yet, and a man she'd spoken to perhaps a dozen times who had told her the most honest thing anyone had said to her in years. She walked toward the carriage that would take her to Ashford Manor. She held the lavender. She did not look back. 这是. The first week of marriage was nothing like she'd expected. She had expected awkwardness. She had expected distance, the kind that comes from two people who don't know each other, trying to share the ordinary moments of a day. Breakfast, supper. The moment someone else is in the room when you thought you were alone. She had braced for it. She had prepared herself to move through it with patience and good humor, and the quiet competence that had always been her best defense against things she couldn't control. What she had not expected was that he would leave her entirely alone. Not unkindly, not coldly. He rose early and was at his desk or his fields by the time she came down to breakfast, and he returned for supper and ate with her and actually spoke about the property, about tenants, about things she understood and could contribute to, and then retreated to his study for the evening. It was like living in the same house as a very organized, very purposeful weather system. It wasn't loneliness exactly. It was more like a question without an answer yet. She managed the house. She organized the kitchen with Mrs. Pratt in a negotiation that took 3 days and ended in a draw that both of them privately considered a victory. She met the household staff one by one and learned their names and what they did better than they'd been asked to do, which was the most useful thing to know about anyone. She walked the property every morning and added to her notebook. On the 5th day, she began the orchard. She started before breakfast in the early cool of the morning, with her new boots and her old gloves and her notebook folded in her pocket. She started at the east end of the orchard with the trees. She was most certain about the ones that needed cutting back, not cutting down. And she worked methodically, one tree at a time, moving through the overgrowth. The way you work through any problem you respect carefully, without rushing, without pretending you know more than you do. She didn't hear him until he'd been standing there for a while. She looked up from where she was crouched at the base of a tree, checking the root line, and he was standing at the edge of the orchard, 10 feet away, in his plain shirt, with his sleeves rolled up and a cup of coffee in each hand, watching her. She straightened up. He walked over and held out the second cup. She took it. She drank. It was black and strong the way she preferred it, and had not yet told anyone she preferred it. She looked at him. "You watched the staff this week," he said. "What they're good at." "Yes." "You asked Herschel about the soil drainage on the north fields." "He knows those fields better than anyone." "You told Mrs. Pratt you wanted to learn where the household accounts were kept, and then you spent 2 hours with them." He paused. "She told me you found an error no one had caught in 14 months. $19, Caroline said. Compounding. Something moved in his face, that same, not quite smile, but warmer than she'd seen it before. "You've been here 5 days, he said. "I told you I had a plan," she said. He looked at the tree she'd been working on, then at the row she'd cleared, then at her notebook, which she'd left open on the stone wall. "Can I?" he started. "Yes," she said. He picked up the notebook. He read it. She watched him turn the pages slowly, her sketched map of the orchard, her tree-by-tree assessment, her pruning schedule, her notes on the borer damage, and which trees she'd marked for removal, and which she believed could be brought back if they were given enough time and enough care. He read every page. He closed the notebook and looked at the orchard, at all of it from east to west, the whole abandoned, struggling, not quite dead expanse of his mother's trees, and something moved across his face that had nothing to do with composure or containment. He handed her back the notebook. "The 2 trees on the western end," he said. His voice was level. "The ones you've marked for removal. My mother planted those herself." Caroline was very still. "I can try to save them. It's less certain." "Try," he said. "All right." He looked at the trees one more moment. Then he looked at her, direct, honest, the way he always looked at her, and he said, "Thank you." It was 2 words, said simply, without ornamentation or performance. She understood they meant something larger than 2 words. "You're welcome," she said. He finished his coffee. He turned to walk back to the house. Then he stopped. "Breakfast is at 7, he said. "I've started coming back for it." She looked at him. "Starting today," he said. If that's acceptable." She held her coffee cup in both hands, and the morning light was in the trees, and somewhere on the far side of the property, she could hear the distant sound of the working day, beginning men and tools, and the productive noise of a large property in motion. "That's acceptable," she said. He nodded once. He walked back to the house. She turned back to the trees. She had 2 western trees to try to save, before she let herself think about the fact that Nathaniel Ashford had started coming back for breakfast. She had work to do. She was already smiling quietly, privately, facing the trees where no one could see it before she even raised her pruning knife. Breakfast at 7 became the first real thing between them. Not the marriage ceremony. Not the agreement in his study with the handshake that was more contract than tenderness. Not even the orchard, though the orchard was where something true had first passed between them. It was breakfast, the ordinary, unglamorous, deeply specific ritual of 2 people sitting across from each other in the early morning. Before the day had made any demands on either of them, that turned out to be where Nathaniel Ashford and Caroline Hale actually began to know each other. He arrived at the table exactly at 7 every morning without exception. She was always already there. She had been rising at 6 since she was 16 years old, and she saw no reason to change that now. And she suspected he knew it, and she suspected he arrived at exactly 7, rather than 6:30, as a small, unspoken accommodation, giving her the first hour of the morning for herself, without making a point of doing so. That was the thing about him she was learning to read. He didn't announce his consideration. He just arranged things quietly so that the people around him had what they needed, and if you weren't paying close attention, you'd miss it entirely and think him indifferent. She was paying close attention. The first morning he came to breakfast, she had set 2 places. He sat down, looked at the table, looked at his coffee and said, "You took the account ledgers apart yesterday. I reorganized them by quarter instead of by creditor," she said. "It's easier to track seasonal patterns. Herschel has been doing them by creditor for 11 years. Herschel isn't wrong. I just find the other way more useful. I left his system intact and made a parallel record." He looked at her for a moment. "Parallel record," he said. "So neither of us has to be wrong," she said. He picked up his coffee. Something shifted in his face, not quite approval. Something quieter and more considered. "That," he said, "is either very diplomatic or very clever." "In my experience," she said, "the best solutions are both." He almost smiled. She watched it not quite happen and felt something warm move through her that she carefully did not name. That was the first morning. It set the pattern for all the others. By the 3rd week, they had developed a vocabulary of small things. He brought tools to the orchard. Not dramatically. Not with announcement. She would arrive in the morning and find a new pruning saw left on the stone wall, or a coil of rope for staking the leaning trees, or once a pair of leather gloves that were better quality than her own left on top of her notebook without explanation or note. She put them on without comment. She wore them every day after that. He noticed things she didn't say and responded to them. When she mentioned once in passing that the household accounts were being charged twice for barrel staves from the same supplier, he had the supplier's contract on his desk within 2 days. When she said nothing at all, but stood at the dining room window 3 evenings in a row, looking toward the field where a tenant family's fence had been broken for a week, the fence was repaired by Thursday. She started doing the same. She noticed that he took his coffee without sugar and his bread without butter, that he read letters twice before answering them, that he held his pen differently, depending on what he was writing, loosely for figures, tightly for words, as though numbers came easy and language required more effort. She noticed that he never spoke about his mother unless she brought up the orchard first, and that when he did, he was careful and brief in the way people are careful and brief about things that still have the capacity to hurt them. She noticed that he watched her work from a distance sometimes. Not intrusively, she would look up from the orchard or from the account books and catch the edge of his attention, moving away the particular quality of a room that someone has just been paying attention to. She didn't call attention to it. She just noted it the way she noted everything and kept working. The county, meanwhile, had not run out of things to say. It was Mrs. Pratt who told her on a Tuesday morning in August that had turned suddenly and viciously hot before 8 o'clock. She came to find Caroline in the kitchen garden, the small one near the house that Caroline had been quietly restoring alongside the orchard, and she stood with her arms folded and her face doing the thing it did when she had something to say that she didn't enjoy saying. "There's talk," Mrs. Pratt said. Caroline kept pulling weeds. "There's always talk, Mrs. Pratt." "Specific talk. Victoria Langston has been telling people you came to the manor with a prepared scheme, that you knew about the grandfather's will before you came, that you timed your visit deliberately to catch Mr. Ashford at a moment of legal pressure." Caroline's hands stilled in the dirt. She sat back on her heels and looked up at the housekeeper. "That's not true. I know it isn't." Mrs. Pratt said it simply without decoration. "You want to know the worst of it? Tell me." "She's saying your father knew about the will too, that Samuel Hale manufactured the debt scenario to engineer a connection between the families." Mrs. Pratt's voice was flat and precise, like she was reading a document she found distasteful. "She's saying you're a scheme, not a woman." The silence that followed lasted exactly long enough for Caroline to understand that what she was feeling, the flash of heat that moved from her chest to her face, was not quite anger. It was something older and more specific. It was the feeling of having something clean called dirty, of having something chosen called calculated, of being reduced in someone else's retelling of your own life to a villain in a story you didn't write. She stood up. She brushed the dirt from her hands. "Where is Mr. Ashford?" she said. "Northfield." She walked to the Northfield. Nathaniel was talking to his field manager when she came through the gate. He saw her from 30 yards away. She was walking with purpose, and she had dirt on her hands, and her chin was set at an angle he'd learned to recognize as the angle of something that needed to be said without further delay. He said 2 words to his field manager and walked to meet her. "Victoria Langston," she said without preamble. "She's telling people my father engineered the debt situation to get me into your house, that I knew about your grandfather's will before I came." He looked at her. "She's telling people we're a scheme," Caroline said. "Your whole county is being told that your wife is a fraud." He was very still. Not the stillness of shock, the stillness of information and already moving past it to what comes next. "Who told you?" he said. "Mrs. Pratt." "How widely has it spread?" "Widely enough that Mrs. Pratt thought I needed to know today rather than when I discovered it accidentally." She met his eyes. "Is there anything in your grandfather's will that was publicly known? Any reason she could have known about it that would give her story credibility?" "The will was filed with the county clerk," he said. "It's public record. Anyone who looked could find it." He paused. "Including your father." "My father," Caroline said steadily, "spent the last 3 years barely leaving the house. He did not engineer anything. He didn't know about the will, and neither did I." She held his gaze. "I need you to believe that." "I do believe it," he said, without pause, without qualification. She'd been prepared for doubt. She'd been prepared to argue, to lay out evidence, to make the case for her own honesty. The way she'd made the case for her repayment plan, methodically page by careful page. She had not been prepared for immediate, unconditional certainty, delivered in the same tone he used to discuss fence repairs and quarterly accounts. Something moved through her that she had to hold very carefully. "Just like that," she said. "Just like that." He held her gaze. "You walked into my house and led with honesty before you led with anything else. That is not the behavior of a woman running a scheme. A scheme requires you to tell me what I want to hear. You told me what was true." He paused. "I'm not going to doubt the thing that made me trust you in the first place." She was quiet for a moment. "She's your friend," Caroline said. "She's known you 20 years. She is my friend," he said. "And what she's doing is wrong, and I'll tell her that myself." He looked at Caroline directly. "But what she's doing doesn't change what I know about you. Those are 2 separate things." She nodded. She breathed. She let the heat behind her sternum settle. "All right," she said. "All right," he agreed. She turned to walk back. He walked beside her, not behind her, not ahead of her, but beside her at her pace all the way back to the gate. He had never done that before. She noticed. What Nathaniel did next, Caroline didn't witness. She learned it the way she learned most things about him after the fact, from sources that were not him. Mrs. Pratt told her some of it. Herschel, the field manager, who had been with the Ashford property for 20 years and had the institutional memory of a county archive, told her the rest. Nathaniel had ridden to the Langston family's rented house in Harrowfield. Victoria's family had come up from Charleston for what was apparently meant to be a summer social season, and had stayed, and he had gone inside and been there for approximately 40 minutes. No one knew exactly what was said. What everyone knew was what happened after Victoria Langston's mother was seen at the dry goods store the following morning, making a point of saying loudly enough to be overheard that of course no one believed those silly rumors. Caroline Ashford was clearly a capable woman, and the manor was lucky to have her. Mrs. Langston said Ashford, Caroline's married name, publicly, in front of witnesses. That was not an accident. Caroline heard about it from Martha Pruitt, who appeared at the manor gate with what she called a social call, but was transparently an intelligence-gathering mission. Caroline gave her lemonade on the front porch and accepted the information graciously, and did not point out that Martha had spent the first 2 weeks of July telling anyone who'd listen that the Hale girl had thrown herself at Nathaniel's feet. People revised their positions. That was human. You let them revise without making them account for every previous version. She told Nathaniel about Martha's visit at breakfast the next morning. He listened. He said, "Was the lemonade good?" "Excellent," she said. I used the mint from the kitchen garden. He said. And then after a pause, I spoke to Victoria. I know, she said. How is she? He looked at her. Slightly surprised, she thought. She's well enough. She's going back to Charleston at the end of the month. He paused. She asked about you. What did she ask? She asked if you were happy. He said it carefully, like he was setting something fragile on a surface, and wasn't sure it would hold. I told her I believed you were. Caroline held her coffee cup. What made you believe that? He looked at her across the breakfast table. You were smiling at the trees this morning, he said, before you knew I was watching. She felt warmth move up from her collarbone to her face and had to look at her cup. The two western trees, she said. The ones your mother planted. The new growth is coming in. I saw. They're going to make it. Yes. His voice was quiet. I thought so too. The silence between them was a different kind of silence than the ones they'd shared in those first weeks. Not empty, not awkward. The full kind, the kind that's generated by two people who are sitting in the same space and don't need to fill it with noise because the space itself is enough. She had not expected this. She had expected a great many things about this marriage and had been wrong about most of them, but she had especially not expected this. The particular sensation of being in a room with someone and feeling without performance or pretense that you are exactly where you are supposed to be. She was careful with that feeling. She set it aside like something she wasn't ready to use yet. It was Herschel who brought her the first real news of trouble on a Wednesday in late August, when the heat had finally broken enough to work outdoors without stopping every hour. He came to the orchard rather than the house, which told her it was something he didn't want overheard. He was a big man, Herschel broad-shouldered, deliberate with hands that looked like they'd been built for the specific purpose of managing large problems. He stood at the edge of the orchard and turned his hat in his hands, which was the gesture men in this county made when they had something to say that they wished they didn't. Mrs. Ashford, he said. The Daly family. She knew the Daly family. Tenant farmers on the eastern boundary of the property, 3 generations in the same house, good workers. She'd met them on her second week at the manor during her systematic introduction to every family on the property. What about them? Their lease renewal came up last month. Mr. Ashford renewed at standard terms. But there's a document being passed around. I don't know where it came from, that says there's a second lien on the eastern acreage. A debt from the old Ashford estate, predating Mr. Nathaniel's ownership. If it's real, the Daly family's land could be called into question. All 6 families on the eastern boundary. She was very still. Where did the document come from? That's the thing, ma'am. No one knows. It just appeared. Courier came 2 days ago to 3 of the tenant families' dropped papers left. Does Mr. Ashford know? He does now. He got the same document from his attorney this morning. He's been in his study since. She thanked Herschel. She went to the house. She knocked on the study door. Come in, Nathaniel said. Howe was at his desk with papers spread across the entire surface, which she'd never seen before. He was a man of rigorous order, and the disorder in front of him was a measure of how quickly this had arrived. He looked up when she came in, and then looked back at the papers. Herschel told you, he said. Yes. Can I see it? He handed her the document without hesitation. She read it carefully. She read it twice. She was not an attorney, but she was a woman who had spent 3 years managing her father's financial disaster. And she knew what a fraudulent document looked like. Not in its legal language, but in its details, the specific places where a lie is most likely to leave a trace. This references a promissory note from 1809, she said, filed with the county clerk's office. Yes, your father purchased the eastern acreage in 1811. Yes. If there was a lien filed before his purchase, it would have appeared in the title search. He would never have completed the purchase with an unresolved lien. His attorney would have caught it. Nathaniel looked at her. That's exactly what I said to my attorney this morning. Then either the 1809 filing is real and was missed, which is possible, but unlikely for a purchase of that size, or someone has accessed the county records and inserted a document that wasn't there before. She set the papers on the corner of his desk. Who benefits from the eastern acreage coming into question? He was quiet for a moment. The eastern acreage, he said carefully, borders the Harrow Creek. It's the best watered land in the county, worth 3 times what the rest of the property fetches per acre. Who's been wanting it? He looked at her steadily. Edmund gasped. He's been approaching me about purchasing it for 4 years. I've refused 4 times. Tell me about Edmund gasped. Merchant. Old money and new ambition, and not enough of either to be comfortable. He's been buying up adjacent land for a decade. He paused. He and the Langston family have shared business interests for 30 years. The name landed between them. She didn't say it. He didn't say it. But it was there. It may not be connected, she said carefully. No, he agreed. It may not. But someone with access to county records and motivation to destabilize the eastern acreage sent that document to your tenants before they sent it to your attorney. That's not how a legitimate debt gets resolved. A legitimate creditor goes to the landowner first, not to the tenant families. Whoever sent this wanted panic before they wanted resolution. He leaned back in his chair and looked at her across the scattered papers. You are, he said slowly, remarkably useful to have in this room. She felt the back of her neck warm. She kept her voice even. I've had practice reading documents people hoped I wouldn't read carefully. Your father's creditors. 3 years of them. She picked up the document again. We need to go to the county clerk's office and look at the original 1809 filing. Not a copy of the original. If it's been inserted recently, there will be inconsistencies. Paper age ink filing sequence. I can send my attorney. Send me instead. He looked at her. I know what I'm looking for, she said. And no one expects a woman to be examining county records for evidence of document fraud. That gives me an advantage your attorney doesn't have. He was quiet. She watched him think, watched him weigh it, not her capability, which she suspected he'd accepted without reservation somewhere around the 2nd week, but the implications of sending his wife into a situation that might have sharp edges. Take Mrs. Pratt, he said finally. Mrs. Pratt. She's been in this county for 50 years, and she knows every clerk and records keeper personally. She'll get you access that a stranger couldn't manage. Caroline looked at him. Then she said, You've already thought about sending someone to check the records. I thought about it for 45 minutes before you knocked on the door, he said. I hadn't figured out who to send. And now you have. And now I have. She picked up the document and folded it into her pocket. She turned toward the door. Caroline. He used her name, not Miss Hale, not Mrs. Ashford, just her name, and she stopped because it was the first time he had, and something about the way he said it, like it had been in his mouth for a while, and he'd finally decided it fit, stopped her completely. She turned back. He looked at her across the disordered desk with his papers and his careful, controlled, privately turbulent attention. Be careful, he said, quietly, directly. She thought about her father saying the same thing at the door of their old house 3 months ago when she was walking to Ashford Manor for the first time. She thought about what those 2 words carried when you meant them and how little they weighed when you didn't. I will be, she said. She went to find Mrs. Pratt. The county clerk's office smelled like dust and old paper, and the particular administrative quiet of a room where important things are routinely made to seem unimportant. Mrs. Pratt walked through its door like she owned the floor it sat on, which Caroline suspected was not far from accurate. The woman had been a presence in this county since before the current clerk's father had been born, and the clerk himself, a thin young man named Gerald, who had been visibly terrified of Mrs. Pratt since he was 12, produced the 1809 filing records within 10 minutes of being asked. Caroline examined the documents while Mrs. Pratt stood to one side and kept Gerald engaged in conversation about his mother's health. She examined them carefully. She looked at the paper, the ink, the way the document was folded, the filing sequence numbers at the top right corner of each page. The numbers were wrong, not dramatically wrong. Not wrong in a way that an average reader would catch or a rushed attorney might notice. But the filing sequence for 1809 ran from 4471 to 4899. The challenge document was numbered 4623. The document immediately before it in the physical file was numbered 4622. The document immediately after it was numbered 4624. But the paper was different. She'd been handling documents for 3 years. She knew what 9-year-old paper felt like. It had a dryness to it, a particular brittleness at the edges, a way of resisting the fingers that freshly pressed paper didn't have. The documents on either side of the challenged filing had it. The challenged filing itself felt like paper that was perhaps 1 year old, perhaps less. She closed the file. She thanked Gerald. She walked out with Mrs. Pratt. On the street outside, she opened her mouth, and Mrs. Pratt said without waiting for her to speak, "I know. The sequence numbers were added after. The ink on the numbers is slightly darker than the rest of the document. Gerald files everything in sequence, date of receipt, and numbers them by hand. A forger wouldn't know to match the ink." Caroline stared at her. "I've been watching county records get mishandled for 50 years, Mrs. Pratt said without inflection. "Shall we go home?" "Yes," Caroline said. "We shall." They went home. She laid it out for Nathaniel in the study that evening. The paper age, the filing sequence, the ink inconsistency, Mrs. Pratt's observation about the numbering system. He listened without interrupting, and then sat back and looked at the ceiling for a moment. "It's enough to challenge it," he said. "It's enough to prove it," she said. "Paper age can be documented. The clerk's numbering system can be testified to. The question is, who had access to the filing room to insert it?" "Gerald," Nathaniel said. "Not necessarily Gerald. Someone with access, a paid intermediary, someone who knew the system well enough to insert the document in the right sequence, but not well enough to age the paper properly." He looked at her. His expression had moved somewhere between grim and something else she couldn't entirely name. "You did this in one afternoon," he said. "Mrs. Pratt did half of it. My attorney had the document for 6 hours and called it potentially legitimate. Your attorney wasn't looking for a forgery. He was looking for a filing error." She met his eyes. "Those are different investigations." He stood up from the desk. He walked to the window. He stood with his back to her for a long moment, and she watched his shoulders, the particular set of them, when he was carrying something heavy. Then he turned. "I need to tell you something," he said. "About the eastern acreage." She waited. "I've had an offer for it before, not just from Gast. There was another offer 2 years ago that I didn't take seriously at the time." He paused. "It came through the Langston family." She held herself very still. "You think Victoria is connected to this," she said. "I think her father might be. Aldous Langston has been looking for a reason to expand north for years. He and Gast share investments." He said it carefully without heat. "I'm not accusing Victoria of knowing. I'm saying the connections are there." Caroline sat with that. She thought about Victoria Langston standing at the churchyard gate in grey watching. She thought about the visit to the Hale house, the composed, honest warning about Nathaniel's character. She thought about a woman who was formidable and proud, and who had lost something she'd expected to have. "It may be her father," Caroline said, "and she may not know." "That's possible. Or she may know and have decided that what her father does is her father's business and not her concern." "Also possible. Or she may know and be glad of it." He looked at her. "Which do you believe?" She thought about it honestly. "The first," she said. "But I've been wrong about people before." He nodded. "My attorney will file the challenge tomorrow," he said. "I'm going to ask for a full investigation of the record's access. It will be disruptive. It will make people talk. Then it will make people talk," she said. "The truth is worth a season of talk." He looked at her for a moment. "You know," he said, "I've spent a significant part of my life being certain that honesty was a liability, that it cost more than it returned." He paused. "I'm revising that position." She felt warmth rise in her throat. She held it carefully. "That's a significant revision," she said. "You've been significantly persuasive," he said. She stood up. "I'm going to check the western trees before dark. The new growth from the pruning should be visible by now." "I'll come with you," he said. She looked at him. He was already picking up his coat. He said it like it was the most ordinary thing in the world, like it was something he'd been doing for years and had simply not mentioned yet. "All right," she said. They walked out together through the late August evening, through the cooling air and the long gold light that came in at that hour, like a verdict. She walked beside him, the way he had walked beside her from the Northfield gate 2 weeks ago, at the same pace, neither of them ahead of the other. At the western edge of the orchard he stopped. She stopped beside him. The 2 trees his mother had planted were standing straight. The suckers had been cleared. The old dead wood had been cut back. And along the remaining branches, in the particular bright green that means something living, has decided to keep going. New growth was coming in. Small. Definite. Undeniable. He looked at the trees for a long time. She didn't say anything. She understood that some moments didn't need words. She had learned that from him, actually, from weeks of watching a man who only said things when they needed saying. He reached over without looking at her and took her hand. Not a dramatic gesture. Not a declaration. His hand closing around hers in the early evening in his mother's orchard in front of 2 trees that had decided not to die. She held on. Neither of them spoke. The western trees stood in the fading light, green and alive and growing, and around them the whole orchard breathed. The investigation into the county records took 11 days. Nathaniel's attorney filed the challenge on a Thursday morning, and by Friday afternoon the entire county knew about it, because that was the nature of a small Virginia town in 1818. Information traveled faster than horses and arrived with considerably more embellishment. By Saturday, 3 versions of the story were circulating simultaneously. One in which Nathaniel Ashford had uncovered a decades-old conspiracy against his family's land. One in which he had manufactured the challenge himself to avoid a legitimate debt, and this one courtesy of Martha Pruitt, who had apparently decided Caroline was worth defending. Now that defending her was the more interesting position in which Caroline herself had single-handedly exposed a forgery that 3 attorneys had missed. That last version was the closest to accurate, which surprised Caroline when she heard it. She heard it from her father, who had taken to visiting the manor on Thursdays. This had begun without discussion or invitation. He had simply appeared at the gate one Thursday morning in early August with his hat in his hands and an expression of careful dignity, and she had opened the gate herself and walked him to the kitchen and given him coffee, and they had sat together for 2 hours, talking about the garden and the orchard and the property accounts, and he had gone home afterward, standing slightly straighter than when he'd arrived. It had happened every Thursday since. "Martha Pruitt says you caught the forgery in an afternoon," Samuel Hale said, turning his coffee cup in both hands. "She's telling people you're the sharpest woman in the county." "Martha Pruitt told people I threw myself at Nathaniel's feet 2 months ago," Caroline said. "People revise," her father said. "Let them." She looked at him. He was better. Not fully himself, she wasn't sure the man he'd been before the debts still existed in quite the same form. But perhaps that man didn't need to. This version of her father, the one who fixed porch steps and held his head up in his own doorway and came to visit on Thursdays with something approaching purpose, was someone she found she respected considerably. "The investigation," she said. "Nathaniel thinks it will resolve within the week. The records clerk has been cooperative. Gerald Fitch has been terrified of Mrs. Pratt since he was in short pants," her father said. "If she was there, I imagine he told everything he knew within the first 5 minutes. He told us who commissioned the document," she said carefully. "Not directly, but the name of the intermediary leads somewhere specific." Her father set down his cup. He looked at her with the eyes of a man who had spent 30 years in commerce and understood exactly how the sentence she hadn't finished was likely to end. "Langston," he said. She didn't confirm it and didn't deny it. She looked at her hands. "Be careful, Caroline," he said, quietly. "Old money fights differently than new money. They don't come at you directly. They use the ground underneath your feet." She thought about the document inserted into the county records. The paper, the ink, the sequence numbers. "I know," she said. "We're being careful." Her father nodded. He picked up his coffee again. He said, "He's good to you, Ashford." It wasn't a question. But it had a question's weight behind it, the weight of a father who had handed his daughter to a stranger. under circumstances no father would have chosen, and who had been watching from a careful distance for evidence that he hadn't done her harm. "He is," she said, simply, without embellishment. Her father nodded again. Something in his face settled. They sat together in the kitchen of Ashford Manor and outside the window. The September morning was beginning to cool at the edges, the way September mornings do in Virginia, carrying the first thin suggestion of autumn in air that was still warm, and neither of them said the other things, the large, shapeless things that didn't have sentences yet. They didn't need to. They were Hales. They had always communicated most clearly in the space between words. The twist came on a Wednesday, 9 days into the investigation, and it came from a direction Caroline had not anticipated. She was in the orchard. She was almost always in the orchard when things happened now, as though the trees had become a kind of gravity, pulling events toward them, when Mrs. Pratt appeared at the East End walking fast. Mrs. Pratt did not walk fast. Mrs. Pratt moved at a pace that communicated that the world could wait for her, and when she departed from that pace, it meant something. Caroline dropped her pruning knife on the wall. "What happened?" she said. "There's a woman at the front door," Mrs. Pratt said. "She won't give her name. She says she has a document she'll give only to you, not to Mr. Ashford, not to the attorney, you specifically." "What kind of document?" "She wouldn't say." Caroline pulled off her gloves. She walked to the house. The woman at the door was perhaps 50, plainly dressed with the careful posture of someone who is not accustomed to standing at the front doors of large houses and is managing their discomfort by standing very straight. She had a sealed letter in both hands, held like something she wasn't sure she should be giving away. "Mrs. Ashford," she said. "Yes," Caroline said. "My name is Ruth Garland. I worked for the Langston family. I was their household accounts keeper for 9 years. She pressed her lips together. "I don't work for them anymore. I left last month. And I took something when I left that I believe belongs to your husband's estate." She held out the sealed letter. "I couldn't give it to a man I didn't know. But I heard about you. What you did in the records office. I thought you'd know what to do with it." Caroline took the letter. She looked at Ruth Garland steadily. "Come inside," she said. "Mrs. Pratt will get you something warm, and you'll tell me everything." Ruth Garland had been sitting at the Langston family's household accounts for 9 years, which meant she had been sitting at the intersection of everything the Langston family spent money on and everything they spent money trying to conceal. She had not, she told Caroline very clearly, considered herself a spy or an informant. She had considered herself a woman doing her job. She had recorded what she was told to record, and had not asked questions about things that seemed designed not to be questioned. But she was also a woman who kept copies. Old habit from a previous employer who had once denied authorizing an expenditure she had recorded and made her personally responsible for the discrepancy. She had never let that happen again. She kept copies of everything in a small ledger that was her own, not the Langston family's, that she took home every evening and brought back every morning. The sealed letter contained 12 pages from that private ledger. Caroline read them at the kitchen table with Ruth Garland sitting across from her and Mrs. Pratt standing against the far wall with her arms folded, radiating the particular focused attention of a woman who has been waiting 50 years for something like this to arrive. The 12 pages, documented in precise accounting language. 3 separate payments made from an account held in Aldous Langston's name to a man named Corbett. No first name given in the ledger. Just Corbett at intervals of 30, 60, and 21 days. The payments began in June. The first payment was made 4 days before the forged document appeared in the county records. Corbett, Ruth Garland told her, was a man she'd seen at the Langston house twice. She didn't know his full name. She knew he had been a county records clerk in a neighboring district until 18 months ago, when he had left that position under circumstances that were not discussed in her presence. She knew the amounts. She knew the dates. She had the ledger pages. Caroline looked up from the papers. "Why did you leave their employment?" she said. Ruth Garland looked at her hands. "Mr. Langston asked me to alter a record last month. Not the county records, a private account. A debt owed to a family of tenant farmers. He wanted the amount changed, made larger, so the family couldn't meet it. She paused. I wouldn't do it. He let me go the next morning. Caroline held the papers in both hands and thought about a man who had tried to insert a fraudulent lien into county records, who had paid a disgraced former clerk to do it, who had pressured his own accounts keeper to falsify private records, and who had been trying for 4 years to acquire the best watered land in the county by any means available to him. She thought about what it cost a woman like Ruth Garland to walk to the front door of a house she'd never been to, carrying stolen copies of her employer's private records, to hand them to a stranger. You did the right thing coming here, Caroline said. I don't know if it'll make any difference, Ruth said. Men like Aldous Langston. It will make a difference, Caroline said. I'm going to make certain of it. She sent for Nathaniel. He arrived from the North Field in under 10 minutes, which meant someone had run. He came through this kitchen door, still in his field clothes, took one look at Caroline's face, took one look at the papers on the table, and sat down. She explained. Clearly, quickly, in the precise order of events, the way she always laid things out for him, not because he needed her to organize it, but because she had learned that they thought most effectively together when she started from the beginning and let him interrupt when he saw the piece she'd missed. He interrupted twice. Both times he was right. When she finished, he picked up the ledger pages and read them himself. The kitchen was very quiet. Corbett, he said. You know the name. I know of a Corbett who worked records in Albemarle County, left after an inquiry into missing documents. He set the pages down. It was never fully resolved. Because Langston bought his way clear, Caroline said. That would be consistent. He looked at her across the table. His jaw was set in the particular way it set when he had decided something and was working out how to execute it rather than whether to. This is enough. For the investigation. For more than the investigation. He looked at Ruth Garland, who had been sitting very quietly through this exchange, holding her composure with visible effort. Miss Garland, I want you to know that what you brought here today took considerable courage, and that I intend to see it used properly. Ruth Garland looked at him for a moment. Then she nodded once, the sharp private nod of someone who needed to be told they hadn't made a mistake and has just received that confirmation. I'll need to stay somewhere, she said. I can't go back to my lodgings. They're paid by the Langston family. Mrs. Pratt, Nathaniel said without turning around. The blue room is ready, Mrs. Pratt said from the wall, as though she had prepared it before anyone asked. Caroline looked at the housekeeper. Mrs. Pratt looked back at her with an expression of complete innocence. Of course it is, Caroline said. The attorney came that evening. He left 2 hours later with the ledger pages, a signed statement from Ruth Garland, and instructions from Nathaniel that were precise enough to leave no room for interpretation. Caroline walked Nathaniel to his study after the attorney's carriage had gone, and she closed the door behind them, and she said what she had been holding since Ruth Garland had appeared at the front door. Victoria, she said. He stopped. She may not have known, Caroline said. But her father's money is the Langston money. She lives in the Langston house. She travels on Langston credit. She looked at him directly. When this becomes public, and it will become public, her name is going to be in the same sentence as his. He turned and looked at her. I know, he said. I'm not asking you to protect her from the consequences of what her father did. I'm asking you. She paused. Chose the next words carefully. When you speak to anyone about this, the investigators, the attorney, the other landowners, be precise. Say Aldous Langston, not the Langstons. Make it specific. Don't make it a family if it's a man. He was quiet for a moment. You're protecting her, he said. Not with surprise. With something more careful. I'm being precise, she said. Because precision is what's fair. And because a woman isn't responsible for her father's crimes just because she shares his name. She held his gaze. I know something about that. The words landed between them, and neither of them looked away from what they meant. He came toward her across the study, past the desk with its scattered papers toward her, and he stopped close enough that she could see the exact shade of his eyes, which she had decided early on were not quite brown and not quite green, but something between the two that she didn't have a word for. "Caroline," he said. "Yes. I need to tell you something I should have told you earlier." Her chest tightened. She held herself still. "When the attorney brought me the forged document," he said, "my first thought before I read it, before I analyzed it, before I thought about the Eastern Acreage or Gast or anyone else, my first thought was that I didn't want you to know. Not because I doubted you, because I didn't want you to have to carry it." She looked at him. "And then," he said, "I realized that was exactly the kind of thinking that makes people feel invisible in their own homes. So I told you. But I want you to know that the instinct was there first, and that the instinct was wrong, and I knew it was wrong in the same moment I noticed it." She was very still. "That is," she said slowly, "the most honest thing you have ever said to me." "I'm working on it," he said. "The honesty. It doesn't come as naturally as the silence." "I know," she said. "I've noticed you working on it." Something moved through his face, the not quite smile, but closer than it had ever been to crossing the distance between not quite and actual. "Have you?" he said. "I'm a very observant person," she said. He reached up and touched her face, one hand the back of his fingers against her cheek, brief and careful, and so precisely itself that it didn't need to be anything more than what it was. She covered his hand with hers before she thought about doing it. They stood in the study with the evening coming through the window, and his hand against her face, and hers against his, and she thought, this is how it happens. Not in declarations. Not in moments designed to be remembered. In an orchard at dusk. At a breakfast table at 7 in the morning. In a study with papers on the desk, and the truth laid out between two people who had agreed to be honest with each other, and were slowly discovering what that actually required. He lowered his hand. She let him. "Tomorrow will be complicated," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "I'll need you in that meeting with the attorney. I'll be there. And after." He stopped. "After," she said, "we'll figure out what comes after. We're good at that." He looked at her for one more moment. Then he nodded. He turned to his desk. She turned to the door. "Caroline?" She stopped. "The western trees," he said without looking up from the papers. "When the fruit comes in. Next year or the year after. I want you to be the one who picks the first one." She stood in the doorway of his study and felt something open in her chest, like a window after a long winter. "All right," she said. She went to bed. She did not sleep immediately. She lay in the dark and thought about what it meant to be handed the first fruit of something that had been waiting. Tended patient slowly returning to life, and she decided that she understood exactly what he meant by it, and that she believed him, and that believing him was the least frightening thing she had done in months. The meeting the next morning lasted 4 hours. 3 attorneys, the county sheriff, 2 witnesses, and a federal land registrar who had been summoned from Richmond on Nathaniel's instruction. Caroline sat at the end of the table and said nothing for the first hour, which was the hour for legal preamble. And then she was asked a direct question by the registrar about the filing sequence inconsistency, and she answered it with the precision of someone who has been thinking about nothing else for 11 days. The room was quiet after she finished. The registrar looked at Nathaniel. "Your wife examined the original documents," he said. "She did," Nathaniel said, "and she has no legal training. She has 3 years' experience managing a financially distressed household under significant pressure," Nathaniel said. "I find it to be a more practical education." The registrar looked at Caroline for a moment. Then he wrote something in his notebook. The investigation expanded that afternoon to include Corbett, who was located within 48 hours at a boarding house in a neighboring county, and the payments from the Langston account. Aldous Langston, when approached by the sheriff 2 days later, denied everything with the particular confidence of a man who has been denying things for 40 years and has never previously been caught. He was not this time left with a position he could defend. Ruth Garland's ledger pages were precise. Corbett, when offered a choice between prosecution as the sole responsible party and cooperation, chose cooperation with the speed of a man who had already calculated exactly how this would end. Edmund Gast, whose name appeared twice in Corbett's testimony as a secondary beneficiary of the Eastern Acreage scheme, sent Nathaniel a letter of apology so elaborate in its protestations of innocence that it functioned as a confession. Nathaniel showed it to Caroline at breakfast. She read it and handed it back. "Keep it," she said. "You'll want it later." "You think he'll try again?" "I think men like Edmund Gast don't stop. They wait." She met his eyes. "Keep the letter." He folded it into the ledger. His ledger, the one that had been under his arm the first morning she saw him, the one that traveled everywhere with him like a second skin. He put Gast's letter in the back of it. She felt watching him do it something that was not quite satisfaction and not quite relief. It was the specific feeling of having done work that was real and having seen it hold. It was the following Thursday, the day her father usually came when the final piece of the thing arrived. She was in the front parlor going through the household accounts when Mrs. Pratt appeared and said, "Miss Langston is at the gate." Caroline set down her pen. She went to the gate herself. Victoria Langston was standing outside it alone, no carriage this time, which meant she had walked or ridden and sent the horse back. She was dressed simply, and her hair was slightly undone from what must have been a long walk, and she looked for the first time since Caroline had known her like a woman who had left her composure somewhere behind her and come anyway. "I won't come in," Victoria said. "I'm not here to ask you anything. I just—" She stopped. She pressed her lips together. Then she said, "I didn't know. What my father did. I want you to know that." Caroline looked at her. "I believe you," she said. Something in Victoria's face moved. "People won't," she said. "They'll assume." "Some will," Caroline said. "The ones worth knowing won't." She paused. Nathaniel was specific. In everything he said to the investigators, your name wasn't included. Victoria was very still. "That was you," she said. "It was his decision," Caroline said. "I suggested the precision. He agreed because he believed it was fair." Victoria looked at her for a long time, the same long measuring look she'd given Caroline in the Hale parlor 3 months ago, the first time they'd met. But it was different now. Less a calculation. More like someone looking at a thing they hadn't expected to find and don't quite know what to do with. "I told you that you'd get hurt," Victoria said. "You did." "I was wrong." "You were working with the information you had," Caroline said. "So was I." Victoria looked at the gate between them. At the Ashford property that stretched behind Caroline, the fields, the distant line of the orchard, the house. "He smiles now," she said. "I heard that from 3 different people. Nathaniel Ashford smiles." She looked at Caroline. "He didn't do that before." Caroline didn't know what to say to that. She let it be true without saying anything about it. "I'm going back to Charleston," Victoria said. "Tomorrow. I hope it's good there," Caroline said, and meant it. Victoria turned to go, then she stopped. "Your orchard," she said. "I heard it's coming back." "It is." "Eleanor Ashford loved those trees," Victoria said. "She used to say you could tell everything about a person by whether they thought a dying tree was worth saving." She looked at Caroline one last time. "She would have known what to make of you." She walked away. Caroline stood at the gate of Ashford Manor and watched Victoria Langston go and thought about Eleanor Ashford, who had loved her trees and raised a son who couldn't bear to cut them down, and about a 24-year-old girl who had looked at a dead orchard and thought, "I can save those." She thought about how much of what mattered in a life was the things you refused to let die. She went back inside. Nathaniel found her in the orchard an hour later. She heard him coming through the grass. She knew his footsteps now, the specific weight and rhythm of them, and she didn't turn around immediately. She was looking at the western trees. His mother's trees. The new growth was full enough now that in the right light you could almost forget they'd ever been struggling. He came and stood beside her. "Victoria came," she said. "I know. Mrs. Pratt told me. She's going back to Charleston tomorrow." "Yes. She wrote to me this morning." He was quiet for a moment. "She said she asked me to tell you that she was glad it was you." Caroline turned and looked at him. "She said she was glad it was you," he said again. Carefully. Like the words mattered in their exact form. Not that it happened the way it happened, but that when it did happen, it was someone like you." Caroline held that. "That was generous of her," she said. "It was honest," he said. "Victoria, whatever else she is honest. It's the thing I've always respected about her." He paused. "It's the thing I respected about you in that parlor on a Monday morning in June. I didn't say that then." "You said something like it," she said. "You just said it the way you say things." "Which is, without announcement," she said, "so that the person who hears it has to decide whether you meant what you said or something larger than what you said." He looked at her. Something behind his eyes that she had been watching build for months, quietly, steadily. The way growth happens when no one is rushing, it had arrived at the surface. "And which did you decide?" he said. She looked at the trees, at the new growth on the western branches bright against the September sky. "Something larger," she said. He reached out. Not her face this time, her hand. He took her hand the way he'd taken it in the orchard at dusk, easy and certain like it was where his hand was supposed to be. She held on. Around them, the orchard breathed in the September air, and the light moved through the recovering branches, and somewhere in the far distance, one of the tenant children was calling something across a field, in a high, clear voice that carried like bells. She didn't name what she felt. She didn't need to yet. It was there, and it was real, and it was built from honesty and hard work, and two people who had decided to look at each other without flinching. That was enough for now. More than enough. The trees stood. The orchard lived. She held his hand and felt the whole solid weight of something true. September gave way to October, the way it always does in Virginia, without asking permission, arriving one morning in the particular quality of the light and the particular edge on the air that tells your body, before your mind registers it, that something has changed. Caroline noticed it first in the orchard. The trees responded to autumn before anything else on the property did, pulling their energy inward, slowing, settling into themselves for the season ahead. She noticed the leaves beginning to turn on the eastern trees and felt something turn in herself as well. A settling, a quieting, the specific internal shift of a person who has been in a long fight and feels for the first time the ground stabilizing beneath their feet. It did not mean the fight was over. She knew better than that. The hearing at the county courthouse was set for the third Tuesday of October. Aldous Langston had spent the intervening weeks doing what men of his type always do when confronted with evidence that cannot be argued away. He hired more attorneys. 3 of them appeared in Harrowfield in the first week of October, and they were expensive attorneys, the kind whose suits announced their cost before they opened their mouths, and they began a systematic campaign of procedural delays that Nathaniel's attorney described to Caroline with barely contained fury as legal harassment dressed in paperwork. Caroline listened to the attorney's frustration with one part of her mind, and with the other part, she was already thinking about what the delays meant practically. More time meant more pressure on the tenant families whose lease security remained technically in question until the lien challenge was resolved. More time meant more opportunity for Langston to work on witnesses, on records, on the specific soft points of a case that was strong but not yet sealed. She brought this to Nathaniel that evening. He was at his desk. He was always at his desk in October, which she had learned was the month the property accounts for the full year were consolidated. Harvests, tallied tenant payments, reconciled the long arithmetic of a working estate, brought to its annual reckoning. He looked up when she came in, and something in her face told him immediately to put the pen down. She laid it out for him. The delay strategy, the pressure points, the witnesses she was most concerned about, particularly old James Daly, the patriarch of the largest tenant family on the eastern acreage, who was 71 and arthritic, and had been visited 3 times in the past 2 weeks by men she didn't recognize. Daly, Nathaniel said. He's the most credible witness to the impact on the tenant families. If Langston's people convince him, it's easier to stay quiet than testify. He won't stay quiet, Nathaniel said. But he said it like a man who believed it, and was also afraid it might not be true. I want to go see him, Caroline said. Not with you, not with an attorney, just me. He looked at her. He's known this family since before you were born, she said. You're his landlord. When you appear at his door, he sees his lease. When I appear, he sees... She paused, looking for the right word. Something different. What does he see when he sees you? A woman who walked 4.5 miles in soaked shoes to do the right thing, she said. Mrs. Pratt told that story to every member of this household within the first week. Stories travel. Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. Go tomorrow morning, he said. Take Herschel. Herschel stays at the gate, she said. I go to the door alone. He looked at her with the particular expression she had come to understand meant he was choosing between arguing and trusting her, and that trust was winning. Herschel stays at the gate, he agreed. James Daly was older than she remembered from their first meeting in August. Not in years, in the way that worry ages people faster than time does. He opened the door himself, and when he saw her, he looked simultaneously relieved and more frightened, which told her everything she needed to know about the state of things. She didn't let him manage the conversation. She stepped inside and sat at his kitchen table, the universal table, the place where every honest conversation in every ordinary house in America eventually happens, and she said, "Tell me what they said to you." He told her. All of it. Haltingly at first, with the cautiousness of a man who had been told explicitly that speaking to anyone connected to the Ashford estate would be considered a violation of something. She listened without interrupting. She let him say the whole thing. When he finished, she said, "James, how long has your family farmed this land?" He blinked. "My grandfather broke that ground. 60, maybe 65 years ago. And in 65 years, has anyone from the Ashford family moved you off it?" "No, ma'am." "Has anyone from this estate called in a debt that wasn't real?" He was quiet. "No," he said. "The document they're using to threaten your lease was forged," she said, plainly, without legal hedging. "I found the evidence myself. A federal registrar confirmed it. The man who made the forgery has already given a signed testimony. Aldous Langston paid for a lie, and the lie is documented. And on Tuesday, it is going to be read into the county record in front of a judge." She held his eyes. "What they told you that staying quiet would protect you, that is the real threat. Because if you don't testify to what they said to you, that goes unrecorded. And men like Aldous Langston depend on things going unrecorded." James Daly looked at his hands. His hands were 71 years old, and they had broken ground and planted seed and brought in harvests. And they were the hands of a man who understood what real work looked like and what real threat felt like. "If I speak," he said, "my family. Your family's lease will be in that courthouse record on Tuesday as a protected interest," she said. "Nathaniel Ashford's attorney has already prepared the documentation. You have my word on that, and you have his." He looked up at her. "Your word," he said. "My word," she said. "I walked into Nathaniel Ashford's house in June with nothing but my word, and he gave me everything on the strength of it. I'm asking you to accept the same from me." The kitchen was quiet. Somewhere in the back of the house, one of the Daly grandchildren was making the small, persistent noise that children make when they're playing and don't know they're being listened to. James Daly looked at that sound for a moment. Then he looked at Caroline. "Tuesday," he said. "Tuesday," she confirmed. She stood. She thanked him. She walked back to the gate where Herschel was waiting, and she got up on the horse, and she didn't say anything for the first half mile because she was thinking about 65 years of a family's life on a piece of land, and what it meant that someone had tried to take it with a piece of paper and a forger's pen, and what it meant that a woman from a bankrupt household had been the one to stop it. Herschel rode beside her in companionable silence. Finally, she said, "He'll testify." Herschel said, "I never doubted it, ma'am." She looked at him. "You have a way of making people remember what they already know is right," he said simply. "I've watched you do it 6 times in 3 months. It's a particular skill." She didn't have an answer for that. She rode home through the October morning and thought about what kind of skill it was and where it came from, and decided it came from the same place. Everything she'd managed to do in the last 4 months came from being willing to say the true thing in a room where the true thing was inconvenient. That was all. It wasn't magic. It was just a refusal to pretend. The courthouse on Tuesday was fuller than Caroline expected. She had expected the principals, the attorneys, the witnesses, the judge, Aldous Langston, and whatever family members he chose to bring for the appearance of solidarity. She had not expected the gallery to be full. But Harrowfield, Virginia was a small county, and the Eastern acreage dispute had been the subject of dinner-table conversation for 11 days. And people came to courthouses the way they'd always come, because the truth being spoken in public is one of the oldest forms of human theater, and people understand it in their bones even when they don't articulate it. She sat beside Nathaniel in the front row behind the attorney's table. She was dressed simply, her best dress, which was not elaborate, but well-made and well-fitted, and she wore her mother's earrings, which she had not worn since the wedding. She had her hands folded in her lap and her back straight, and she looked at the front of the room and did not look at Aldous Langston, who was seated across the aisle with 3 attorneys, and the careful composure of a man who had decided his best defense was to appear very relaxed. Nathaniel's hand found hers under the edge of the gallery railing. She turned her palm up. He held on. The judge entered. What followed was 4 hours that felt both very long and very fast, in the way that important things always do. Time moving strangely when the stakes are real. The federal registrar testified to the paper age inconsistency and the filing sequence anomaly. The county clerk testified to his own numbering system and confirmed that the document in question had not been filed through his office. Corbett's signed testimony was read into the record. Ruth Garland took the stand and spoke in the clear, precise voice of a woman who had decided that telling the truth was simpler than any of the alternatives, and she read the payment dates from her private ledger without once looking at Aldous Langston. Langston's attorneys objected to 17 separate items. The judge sustained 4 of them and overruled 13. Then James Daly walked to the stand. He was 71 years old and arthritic, and he walked slowly, and the courtroom was completely quiet while he did it. He sat down. He was sworn in. And then, in the deliberate voice of a man who has decided to say a thing and will say it completely, he described the visits. The men he didn't know. What they said to him. The implicit threat against his family's lease. All of it in exact sequence with the kind of detail that only comes from something you've been going over in your mind for 2 weeks. When he finished, the judge looked at him for a long moment. "Mr. Daly," the judge said, "were you advised by anyone that testifying today would place you in any kind of legal jeopardy?" "I was told it might," James Daly said. "By Mrs. Ashford. She told me it wouldn't." The judge looked at Caroline. She did not look away. The judge said nothing further on the point. He made a note. He proceeded. Aldous Langston's attorneys presented their case for 40 minutes. It was, Caroline thought, watching it with the detached attention she brought to things she'd already decided about, a technically sophisticated argument built on a foundation that had been pulled out from under it 11 days ago in a county records office by a woman with dirty hands and a notebook. The structure was still standing. There was simply nothing under it anymore. The judge recessed for 90 minutes. When he returned, he read his ruling in the measured, specific language of a man who has been doing this long enough to understand that the words he says in this room will be repeated in other rooms for years. The lien was fraudulent. The eastern acreage was clear. The tenant leases were confirmed and protected. Aldous Langston was referred for criminal investigation on charges of records fraud and witness intimidation. His attorneys were still writing when the gavel came down. The courtroom exhaled. Nathaniel's hand tightened around hers. She didn't make a sound. She sat still and straight and let the ruling land in her body, the way rain lands on dry ground, absorbed immediately, completely, with the particular relief of something that has been needed for a long time finally arriving. Beside her, Nathaniel turned and looked at her. She turned and looked at him. He said nothing. Neither did she. They had learned, the two of them, that the most important things didn't need sentences. Behind them in the gallery, someone began to clap. Then someone else. Then the room, not all of it. Langston's people filed out in brittle silence, but enough of it. Enough to fill the space. James Daly, making his slow way down from the stand, caught Caroline's eye across the room and nodded once. The sharp, private nod of a man who has done the right thing and knows it. She nodded back. The ride home was quiet. Not the quiet of exhaustion, the quiet of completion, which is a different thing. The quiet of two people who have been in the middle of something difficult for a long time and have just come out the other side, and are taking a moment to simply breathe the air that exists after the difficulty. Her father was waiting at the manor gate. She didn't know how he'd known Mrs. Pratt probably, or Herschel, or the simple fact that news in Harrowfield traveled faster than horses, and Samuel Hale had been in this county for 30 years and still knew everyone worth knowing. He was standing at the gate with his hat in his hand, and his face doing the thing it had been slowly, painstakingly doing since August, reassembling itself into something that resembled the man he'd been before the shame got in. She climbed down before the carriage fully stopped. He opened his arms, and she walked into them, and he held her, the way fathers hold daughters when they're trying to say something that doesn't have words yet, tightly, completely, without pretense. "I heard," he said. His voice was rough. "It's done," she said. "It's over." He held on for one more moment. Then he stepped back and looked at her, and looked at Nathaniel, who had come to stand slightly behind her, and to one side. And he looked at the two of them together with an expression that was grief and pride, and relief and gratitude, all occupying the same space simultaneously, the way complicated feelings do in people who have stopped pretending feelings are simple. He extended his hand to Nathaniel. Nathaniel shook it. Not the contractual handshake of that first morning in the study, something warmer than that, with the specific weight of men who have arrived at a respect that was earned rather than assumed. "Thank you," Samuel Hale said, "for what you did for my family." Nathaniel looked at Caroline, then back at Samuel. "Your daughter did most of it," he said. "I mostly stayed out of her way." Her father looked at her. His eyes were bright. "Yes," he said. "That sounds about right." "Ken." The first apple came in on a Thursday morning in late October from one of the western trees. She found it herself just after 7 before breakfast in the thin early light. She had come to the orchard the way she came every morning, from habit, from love, from the specific need she had developed over these months to begin each day with the trees before she began it with anything else. She was walking the western row when she saw it, a small apple, the first hanging from a branch of the tree that had had borer damage on the trunk, and that she had spent 2 careful weeks nursing through August. Red-green. Perfect. The size of her closed fist. She stood and looked at it for a long time. Then she reached up and picked it. She held it in both hands. It was cool from the morning air, and it was heavier than it looked, the way real things always are, and she could smell it. That specific apple smell that is summer stored and condensed and made into something you can hold. She heard his footsteps in the grass. She didn't turn around. He came and stood beside her, and she held out the apple. He took it. He looked at it. He turned it in his hands the way he turned his hat when he was thinking. That gesture she had learned to read like a word. "The western tree," he said. "Your mother's," she said. He was quiet for a moment. She waited. "She would have been out here at dawn to find this," he said. "She never missed the first one." Caroline looked at the tree, at the branch it had come from, at the new growth all along that branch, full and definite, the evidence of a thing that had decided to live. "Tell me about her," Caroline said. And he did. He talked about his mother for a long time, standing in the orchard in the October morning with the apple in his hands, about Eleanor Ashford, who had planted these trees and taught him to read the weather by watching the birds, and who had told him once when he was perhaps 9 years old and had just failed at something and was humiliated about it, that the only real failure was refusing to go back. He had never told anyone that story. She understood that. She understood it from the specific quality of his voice when he said it, careful, not because it was difficult, but because it was precious. The way you're careful with something you've been keeping safe for a long time and are only now deciding to set down. She didn't interrupt. She just stood beside him and let him talk, and the orchard breathed around them, and the morning light moved through the recovered branches, and somewhere on the far side of the property, the working day was beginning in the distant productive sounds of a healthy estate. When he finished, there was a silence that was the fullest kind. The kind that means something has been said that needed saying, and has landed where it needed to land. He looked at her. "I thought I was saving your family," he said quietly. "In June, when I made the offer, I thought I was the one doing the rescuing." She looked back at him. "I know you did," she said. "I was wrong about that. You were working with the information you had, she said. His own phrase returned to him. Something moved across his face, the not quite smile, and then further than that, past not quite all the way to actual. A real smile. Unguarded, unhurried, the kind that changes a face so completely that it looks like a different person, and simultaneously more like the true person than anything you've seen before. She had not seen him smile like that. Not once in 4 months. Not even close. She felt it land in her chest, like a hand against a door she hadn't known was waiting to be opened. "I love you," he said. Simply, without preamble or performance. The way he said everything that mattered like it was true, and therefore needed saying, and the only question had been timing. She looked at him. At his face in the October morning, with his mother's apple in his hands, and the recovered orchard all around them, and everything they had built together in 4 months. The honesty, the breakfast table, the parallel ledgers, the pruning saw left on the stone wall, the hand taken in the dusk, the courtroom, the gate, all of it, every day of it, present in the air between them, like a thing you could touch. "I know," she said. "And then, I love you too." He reached out. She took his hand. They stood in the orchard and held on. The years that came after were not without difficulty. Caroline would have been the first to say so, and she would have said it plainly without apology, because she had never been a woman who confused the truth of a hard thing with an argument against it. There were bad harvests and difficult winters. There was a fire in the mill in the spring of 1820 that took 3 weeks to recover from and tested every person on the property, and came through the other side because they had built in the 2 years prior, the kind of trust between landowner and tenant that does not collapse under pressure. There were arguments, real ones, honest ones, the kind that two people who both mean what they say will inevitably have, and each time they found their way back to the table and the truth, because that was the only method they had ever used, and the only one that had ever worked. Samuel Hale lived in his house until he was 74. He consulted for 3 merchants in his final decade and was considered a reliable voice on trade routes that younger men hadn't traveled yet. He came to the manor every Thursday until the last year of his life, when the walk became too much, and then Nathaniel sent a horse for him, which Samuel accepted with the specific dignity of a man who has learned that accepting a hand is not the same as falling. He died in the spring, quietly, in his own house, with his daughter's hand in his. Ruth Garland stayed at Ashford Manor for 6 months, and then went to work for a merchant family in Richmond, who needed someone with her particular skills and her particular understanding of how accounts told stories. She wrote to Caroline twice a year for 20 years. Mrs. Pratt outlasted everyone's reasonable expectations and retired at 73, at which point Caroline gave her the small house at the east end of the property and visited her every week. The orchard bore fruit every autumn. The western trees, Eleanor's trees, bore the most. And every year on the first Thursday of harvest, when the workers came in from the eastern and western rows with the season's first picking, Caroline Ashford walked the western edge of the orchard herself and took the first apple from Eleanor's branch and held it for a moment before she put it in the basket. Not for sentiment exactly, for memory. Because she had learned in those 4 months in 1818 that changed everything that memory kept at the cost of discipline and honesty is a different thing from nostalgia. It is a document of what you decided and who you chose to be and what you refused to let die. Harrowfield, Virginia forgot many things over the years, the way small towns forget the edges of their own stories. It forgot exactly how the Ashford lien case had resolved. It forgot the names of Langston's attorneys. It forgot eventually that there had ever been a question about the eastern acreage at all. What it did not forget, what passed from one household to the next, in the way that true things always eventually travel, was that Nathaniel Ashford had married a bankrupt merchant's daughter who'd walked to his door in soaked shoes, and that she had rebuilt his orchard and exposed a fraud and stood up in a courthouse and held her ground, and that under her hand the Ashford estate had become the kind of place that tenant families stayed in for generations, because staying was better than leaving, which is the highest testimony any piece of land can receive. They remembered her name, not as Samuel Hale's indebted daughter, not as the woman who'd made an arrangement that suited them both, not as the girl from the debt. They remembered her as Caroline Ashford, The woman who had walked 4.5 miles with nothing but her word, and her honesty, and a plan she believed in, and had turned all of it into something that lasted. She had not come to be saved. She had come to do what was right. And in doing what was right, she had built a life that neither fear nor shame, nor the cruelty of small minds could touch, because it was founded on the only thing that ever holds the truth spoken plainly to the right person at exactly the right time. That was enough. That was everything.